to Ottawa Experts. I'm your host, Barbara Balfour. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, who died in 2011, once said, "Remembering that I'll be dead one day is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life." In many cultures, having ongoing access to spiritual, physical, and emotional support is a fundamental part of life's inevitable transition into death. But in Western culture, death is more hidden. Death is highly sanitized, and people will often put off or completely avoid having discussions about death or even thinking about it. But the current global health crisis is forcing people to change their mindset. COVID-19 has reminded us all that life can change in an instant. And so we've been forced to consider our mortality in ways that have never before felt so immediate and so urgent. So how do you bridge the gaps between medical care and the emotional and spiritual facets of death? The answer lies in normalizing the experience of death, because death, just like birth, is a natural and unavoidable part of life. And that includes not just the physical deaths of our loved ones, but as one of our guests tonight will detail for you later on, the death of ways of life, old routines, marriages, friendships, careers, all those major life changes that force us to make a decision to choose one thing and have to give up another. Tonight's panel of guests will explore the idea of how dying well can be viewed as a fundamental part of living well. In other words, how we can use death to live more fully. First, I am so pleased to welcome Reverend David McGinley. He is a Lutheran minister, a chaplain in cancer and palliative care with Nova Scotia Health, and the author of Beyond Surviving Cancer and Your Spiritual Journey. David has also survived cancer 4 times, which led to a profound near-death experience and explorations in grief, hope, and the mystery of consciousness. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you, Barbara. So good to be here.
Next, I'm so pleased to welcome Janelle Hardy. Janelle is an artist, a creator, and a teacher of an online transformational memoir writing course called The Art of Personal Myth-Making. This course helps people heal from their life stories as they write their memoirs. Janelle also incorporates grief work into all of her services and is also the creator of the course Riding the Waves, Honoring Your Grief. Thank you so much for joining us, Janelle.
Thanks, Barbara. I'm really happy to be here.
The feeling is mutual. Now, you're also so kind as to give away a spot in your course tonight. Tell us a little bit about that. It's a spot in your course, Riding the Waves, Honoring Your Grief. How does that work? Is it self-directed?
Yeah, it's a sweet and simple self-directed course delivered by email weekly. There's 5 lessons that incorporate expressive writing, different ways of approaching and understanding grief, and prompts that really bring you into the somatic, into the body space of opening up room for your grief to reveal itself to you and to start moving through it. One of the most wonderful reasons that I love grief work is that when we start to really grieve and move through our grief, we get to tap into a tremendous source of joy on the other end of it.
And I think people often lose sight that that joy even exists. So that sounds like a wonderful course, very helpful to one of our viewers tonight. So if you're watching and want a chance to win, just reach out to us at Rogers TV social media, either on our Facebook page or Instagram. We'll put your names in a draw and draw a winner by the end of the week and contact you and give you the details to access that course. Again, thank you so much, Janelle. Now I want to introduce our last guest tonight. Joining our panel is Rena Lazar. She is the co-founder of Willow End of Life Education and Planning, which offers heart-centered tools and workshops to explore the reality of your mortality and live fully now. Rena is also a conflict resolution, communications, and program development expert with extensive training in community-based death care. Welcome to the show, Rena. And you're also giving something away tonight. Tell us what that is.
Sure. Yes, we have workbooks called 7 Tools for Making Sense of Life and Death. And we're giving away, I think we agreed up to 5 for however you choose them. And so this is a workbook that has foundational work for end-of-life planning. It's basically many questions which can be summarized in who and what matter most opening up like your hopes and fears, learning from the past, and basically 4 more exercises in there that are a essential foundation for end-of-life planning. And if you're someone who's stuck with end-of-life planning, or you've done it but it doesn't really reflect who you are, this is a really great tool to get you moving. And it's an inquiry and self-discovery book as well.
Thank you so much, Rena. And again, for our viewers who are tuning in and just joining us tonight, if you just want to reach out to us on our social media channels, we'll find a way to enter you in the draw and give you a chance to win this. Now, I want to start our conversation tonight by asking each one of you, how can you, or how do you, talk about death in a way that's not emotionally draining? How do you stay death positive? I know it's an actual movement. I want to start with you, David, because you've actually stared death in the face 4 times. Tell us about what that's been like and how you're able to channel your life lessons into helping other people now, which has become your calling.
Well, Barbara, to be honest, each time I have faced death, I have done so inconsistently and awkwardly, negotiating with mortality. But when I found I was deeply present with all of the mess that was in my gut and in my heart and in my mind, when I was just deeply present with that, I discovered a centeredness. There was a calm place. I believe we're wired with the wisdom to come into this world, and we're wired with the wisdom to leave it. That's what the hundreds of patients I've been with as they've died have been teaching me over and over and reminding me of what I faced. To trust that the grief and the anxiety are temporary, to realize you don't need to actually believe everything you think or be controlled by everything you feel about death. Showing up compassionately and curiously with it brings us to a deeper dimension of being.
I think that's wisdom that can be obtained certainly through life experience. Thank you so much for that, David. Janelle, I'm interested in hearing how you got into, I guess, this line of work, into offering grief work as part of your services. How did your course come about, and what have been your own personal experiences with writing memoirs as a way to heal and to grieve?
What a big question. I'll try to keep it brief. I started by doing hands-on body work, hello work structural integration, which is all about releasing restrictions in the physicality of our body and our connective tissue in order to feel more free.
Is that like craniosacral therapy, those sorts of modalities?
That's a great therapy, but no, structural integration is like rolfing, ROLF, for those who've heard of it. It's very deep tissue massage, different than regular massage therapy though. And I've always been a writer and an artist. And so working so closely with people and so intimately and with their bodies, it just became really clear that grief is something that's not talked about, but that is waiting to be acknowledged and released for almost everyone, all the different kinds of griefs that just simply aren't spoken about often in our culture. And so my work has evolved out of an apprenticeship with people, as well as my trainings and where the currents are taking me. And for my own personal writing, I get a lot of comfort and insight out of shorter memoir, nonfiction style pieces.
Wonderful. And what about you, Rena? How do you have those difficult conversations, and how did you get into this line of work?
2 different questions, but I've always been drawn to the big existential questions in life, like why are we here? What's our purpose? What's going on? And like many people, I've had death scares. I haven't had a near-death experience like David has, and I haven't sat with very many people who were dying. I've sat with a few. But when I was 16 years old, I was in a really bad car accident where it flipped, and I thought I was going to die. Myself, and the 3 other passengers we were all good. Nobody was seriously hurt. But one of the first things I did when I got home that day, when I was finally safe at home, is I took out some paper and pen, and I wrote love letters to my 3 best friends at the time. Told them how much I love them, what I wanted for them. And the interesting part of all this is, why does it take such a terrifying incident to have those expressions of love like that? And I believe it's because death is the most powerful tool out there to get us to living and loving fully now. And it was very interesting when you invited me to this program, and you said, we're going to talk about how death can help us live more fully. And I thought, well, that's perfect. That's kind of the mission of what I do in life, is I help people have conversations about the end of their lives so that they can reflect on their present lives now. So we work with mostly healthy people, and we like to say all that matters in the end actually matters now.
Very interesting. I want to flip the conversation back to David, because I'm sure as a chaplain you have a lot of those end-of-life conversations. What's the one thing that you've seen people regret the most when they're on their deathbed?
Oh, it is always the same thing. It is the unfinished love story. It is the words left unspoken. The 4 critical things to say when you're dying is, thank you, I love you, I forgive you, and I ask your forgiveness, and then goodbye. This is how we unpack for the ultimate journey. And when we do it well, there is a clarity in our consciousness that is difficult to articulate. We all tend to have broken bits, rubble of relationships in the wake of our journey. And if you can be compassionate and tender to those broken bits, not necessarily needing to integrate them again, but just letting them go with a humanity, realizing it's all part of our awkward road to a transformation. I love helping people do that. You know, the tears come, the hesitancy, the flutter in the throat and the voice, and then reaching perhaps a place of silence where we can just stay with it, and then even to facilitate those conversations of reconciliation, to talk about the hopes that were not fulfilled. And that brings us to being able to engage with curiosity about whatever is on the other side. It's truly beautiful work to engage with the dying. I know, Rena and Janelle, you feel this, you know it, and it's the greatest privilege. People will ask, how on earth can you do this? And it's more like, how can we not? This deepens our humanity, it amplifies our love, and it prepares us for the day of our own transformation. It's absolutely astounding.
I love everything you're saying, David, and the wonderful thing about these points that you bring up is that we don't have to wait until we're on our deathbeds to say words like, I forgive you, please forgive me, and I love you. We're just about to go to commercial break, but when we come back, more tips and strategies from our panel tonight on how we can use death to live more fully. Don't go away, we'll be right back.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
On the next Simply Cooking by Chef, a few hours of meal preparation once a week can save you time and money later on.
I love to have a chicken roasted ready to go for the rest of the week. You can use it for so many different recipes, meals, and even as a snack.
No matter your dietary restrictions, Chef Daniela has many other options you can do. Find out what they are on Simply Cooking by Chef, right here on Rogers TV.
Where did she come from? She's just black and white. She told me everything is gonna be alright.
Every year, dozens of Canadians are killed or seriously injured because they take risks around railway tracks. Talk to your loved ones about rail safety. Visit stoptracktragedies.ca.
Welcome back to Ottawa Experts. I'm your host, Barbara Balfour, and on tonight's show we're discussing how death can help us live more fully. David, I'd like to go back to you. We were chatting just before we went to break, but you've survived cancer 4 times. You've written a book about some of your experiences and sharing your wisdom with others. Tell us a little bit about your journey. How did each diagnosis come to be, and how do you feel today?
I've had a very strange and rare cancer called paranganglioma. It sits encapsulated as a tumor that makes different chemicals that are like a Molotov cocktail, dopamine, norepinephrine. So instead of spreading out through the body and compromising your health, it sits, the gland goes off, it's a switch, and the tumor blows. Most people die right away in about 30 seconds or a minute. I'm very lucky to have survived it 4 times. The signs are like an anxiety attack, cramps in the stomach, sweating, racing heart, and many times I've passed out, and the only way to get rid of it is through surgery. So I had to learn meditation as a way to override my sympathetic nervous system, to regulate my adrenaline, to go deep and center and stay in the moment. And some days I did that really well, and other days I really didn't at all, and I would crash to the floor. The cancer has taught me more about how to be present in the moment, and yet I'm so amused by how inconsistent I continue to be with that. The mind interrupts you actually about every 5 seconds. So having a sense of humor with yourself seems to be one of the greatest assets of mindfulness practice. And of course, it awakened that unfinished love story. And as I look back now, I see, as many of us do, how I have loved poorly through the years, and yet how I am very happy with how I love now. I think I've learned a few things. It's not that I'm always wise with my energy. I still tend to be foolish and distracted by pretty shiny things, but it's a clarity that it embeds deep in your heart and awakens you to the gift of ordinary things.
Now
we can grow through this, not just go through it.
Now you've written a book to help others go through the journey. We can pull up the cover of the book right now on the screen, and it's also won an award. Tell us a little bit about what brought you to write this book and what kinds of tips you share in there about people embarking on this spiritual journey.
What caused me to write the book was emotional cholesterol. The case is when you're swimming in suffering, you can't help but get wet. And it was building in me until it burst out one day with a very difficult case. And I found I was being woken at 4 a.m, and I went to the computer and I would pour it out. It weaves my 4 journeys with cancer, with cases from the hospital, and then reflections on how to grow through cancer. Right, how to use the crisis to attend to the essential matters of the heart and of life, and investigate the mystery of consciousness and what I feel we become.
Now, are you in remission right now?
I am, thankfully. If there was anything to learn from cancer, I guess it took me 4 times. I'm not the brightest student, but I've been in remission for over 20 years now, so I think I'm in the clear.
That's fantastic. Now, everything that you're saying about writing being a release and an outlet, I'm sure, Janelle, you can relate to this. This is something that you teach as part of your calling. Tell us a little bit about some of the teachings. What's it like taking your course? What are some of the things that you've heard from your students?
Yeah, so my Art of Personal Mythmaking course is all about healing as well as memoir writing. And people find me with either the intention to heal and they like writing, or they have an intention to write their memoir and don't really realize there might be healing involved, but there always is. One of the big surprises for most of my students is actually the necessity to start grieving. And I usually start everyone off with acknowledging and discussing what grief is and why it might come up. It sometimes seems like a heavy way to start a course about writing your life stories down, but people often put off a desire to write their life stories for 10, 20, most recently a student confessed to 35 years holding that desire to explore and examine their life, to offer that as a gift. Often people want to be a good ancestor. This is a growing kind of idea and movement to offer something to future generations by examining their lives and healing in the process. But what happens when we look at all of our experiences and our life stories is there are painful stories, there are joyful stories, there are choice points where maybe we chose in a way that was hurtful or felt wrong, or that has taken a while to bring us back into direction. All of these experiences are little deaths. They're little deaths of identity. For example, I've been a single mother for my daughter's whole life, and now she's on her own. She's 18, and I am an empty nester. And so I'm actually in the middle of my own little death of who I was for 18 years, which consumed so much of my attention, to becoming an empty nester, for lack of a better term. Being in that transitional state in a culture that doesn't offer rites of passage, community support, ceremony and ritual and celebration to shift from one state of life into another. All of these experiences where we don't get rites of passage, but we're in a transition, or we've made a choice and have to leave behind a loved one or a community or a job, or maybe the choice wasn't ours, but it's changed, really requires grieving. And again, in a culture where grieving is a scary thing and there's not a lot of support for it, it's often not acknowledged. And so then there's a second layer of grief, that the pain that people experience in these big changes and these little deaths in their life doesn't get acknowledged as much as it should. So these are patterns that I notice and work with.
I've often remarked, Janelle, that it's much more socially acceptable to grieve the loss of a relationship, a romantic relationship, or a marriage, but it's still not socially acceptable to grieve the loss of a friendship, for instance, but that can sometimes be even more devastating. And I imagine you see a lot of those kinds of losses and maybe unexpressed griefs pop up in your work with your students.
Yeah, and actually one of the biggest feelings of loss is not having access to your own family stories, family histories, not knowing anyone beyond grandparents, if that. There's a lot of active forgetting of where people come from, language and culture and story-wise. And so when people start wanting to offer that forward, facing the grief of, but I don't know who I come from and what peoples I come from really know. I don't have the stories because they've stopped being passed down, and people get married far less. People actually don't have funerals the way that they used to. All of these gathering points of community and family where stories are shared have been disappearing. And so that's actually a really big grief, is not knowing your roots.
It's great to have an outlet like your workshops, for instance, Janelle. Now, I want to go back to Rena. I know one of your talking points and really one of your values is that mortality is an opportunity in disguise. And you certainly experienced that firsthand when you told us earlier in the show that when you were 16 and you were in a bad car crash, you immediately went home and started writing letters to the ones that you cared about the most. And how wonderful that is, and how terrible that it often takes a shattering experience like that to force us to tell the people around us that we love them or to re-examine our values. Tell us a little bit about how mortality is actually an opportunity in disguise. How can we, I guess, reframe the narrative?
It's a great question. I mean, mortality is an opportunity in disguise because, like I said, sometimes it takes death to realize how precious and finite life is. You mentioned it, the other speakers mentioned a little bit, how most people are kind of in death denial in our society. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to think about it. Now, of course, there are some people who do think about it all the time, people who are in more precarious situations. If you consciously contemplate the fact that someday, one day, and we don't know when, whether you have 10 weeks or 10 years to live, when you consciously contemplate that, you get more in touch with what is so beautiful about being alive. And David described it so beautifully, and Janelle with the work she does, people probably discover this in the work in their memoir work all the time. We do very similar things. We offer tools and resources for people to think about what's important to them at the end of their lives, really so they can reflect at what's important now. And kind of like what Janelle said, there's two different reasons people do this kind of work. Sometimes they come to us because they just really want to get their stuff done, like they want to get their end of planning in place. And then in the process, they actually go quite deep, and they do a lot of very personal, deep reflection work, and they're very grateful for that. And some other people come because they're just very curious about the mystery of death, and they want to learn more about that. And, wouldn't it be nice to also get my end-of-life planning plans in place?
You have a lot of great resources on your website, Rena, and I'd love to do a deep dive into some of those tips and strategies, but we just have to go to commercial break now. We'll be right back after this. Don't go away.
Each week on Grill This, Smoke That, Steph Legary showcases delicious recipes from across Canada, all done on the grill. Join Steph and his special guests on Grill This, Smoke That, Fridays on Rogers TV.
There are soldiers in my family. I first joined the Legion to honor their service. Now I volunteer there to be of service myself. I know my membership helps Canadian veterans get the support they need. I've personally seen it help veterans get through some pretty dark times. Many have come out stronger than ever. For a lot of them, the Legion feels like home. It's nice to be part of that.
For the latest, listen to City News 1011.
More news around the arrival of the COVID-19 vaccine.
Find out what's happening in Ottawa and the Valley.
Affordable housing crisis deepens amid the latest LRT.
With breaking news as it happens and candid conversation from The Rob Snow Show. Stream City News on your device or listen at 1011 FM. Number one for local news. This is City News 1011.
Are you a woman experiencing abuse? Do you know a woman experiencing abuse? Help is available any time of day or night. ShelterSafe.ca is an online map that helps you find a women's shelter or transition house that meets your needs so you can live a life free from violence. ShelterSafe.ca. Help is just a click away.
Welcome back to Ottawa Experts. I'm your host, Barbara Balfour. On tonight's show, we're discussing how death can help us live more fully. I find it interesting how murder shows, murder mysteries, true crime shows are all the rage right now. They're all over Netflix. People love a good, gory crime thriller or murder show, and yet we're still so squeamish as a society in the Western world when it comes to talking about death in a serious, meaningful way. And to that end, Rena, I'd like to talk to you more about one of the resources on your website, and that's 5 steps for successful end-of-life planning conversations. You send us an image for that. We'll just pull that up on the screen now. Talk us through what those steps are. I mean, how do you you have that talk with someone else, and how do you have that talk when you're the person who's planning your own end of life?
Yeah, great. I loved creating this tool because I have a background in conflict resolution, and there's a lot of very universal tips here. But when it comes to end-of-life planning, like you said, it's squeamish and taboo, and there's some people who, the old, I'll cross that bridge when I get there, putting it off, putting it off. So we have 5 steps. The first one is to set your intention. So basically, why do you want to have this conversation? So say I wanted to have a conversation with someone who's very reluctant to having this conversation. So I would just personally set, what do I want to get from this conversation? I'd set that intention for myself. And then I would identify my concerns, which might sound counterintuitive, but if I can say to myself, I'm really worried that this person isn't going to want to talk about it. I'm really worried that this person will tell me I'm morbid or something like that. I'll identify them for myself, and I'll actually bring those concerns up before I start the conversation. It's sort of like, if you have children and you say, and you want them to clean their room, and you say, I have something I want to ask you, but I know you're not going to like it. It usually kind of breaks the ice and gets them ready for that, gets their mind ready for something. So you kind of, you identify concerns and you learn to articulate and share those concerns with the person. And then you create the context. So what that means is you would say, the reason, basically it's kind of like, what are some of the reasons I want to have this conversation? And it could be, when Aunt Betty died and her funeral was really, it was really beautiful. And I just really want to make sure that when you die or when I die or whoever you're talking about, that our situation is as beautiful too. Or it could be the opposite. It could be, so-and-so had a very terrible experience in all the months leading up to their death. And there were just so many things that could have been avoided. I just want to make sure we don't have that situation, that kind of thing. And it's similar to the next step, which is your motivation. And so an example, my business partner was talking to her dad, who was one of those people that said, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. So she said, Dad, my brother and I, we want to talk to you about this. Well, she said, the reason I want to talk to you is because I'm afraid that my brother and I, we're not going to agree. Like after you die, we're going to have a conflict between us. So that was a big motivator for him. Okay, let's start talking. And then the final step very quickly is to reflect on the conversation and what went well and what was challenging, so that the next time you have it, you just bank on what went well and avoid, the problems.
Is there a way to bring joy or humor into those conversations? It almost seems silly asking this question, but how can you take on, I guess, a more lighthearted approach?
I think that when people talk about things that are really important to them, love comes out. The love and what is important comes out. And I think with love comes joy, and often with joy, depending if you're, a humor kind of person or a humor kind of family, humor will just follow. I used some of these tools with a conversation with my 5 siblings. My parents died. Actually, my mother's anniversary of her death was yesterday, 18 years ago, and my father died 5 months before that. But years later, we got together to talk about how we wanted to be cared for after we die, because I have no idea. They're my next of kin. And we went through these tools, and yes, there were tears, but oh my God, we got so close talking about it. And the rest of that day, it was a morning conversation. We were all at my sister's house. It was full of laughter and joy. It's like both the other speakers have already said, grief brings joy. That's just what it does.
And that's a great segue to a question I wanted to ask you, David. Now, you're a man of God, and I know you say that God is love, which is something I think is really helpful for, I guess, atheists to wrap their mind around. And I'm just wondering, from your experience, do religious people or spiritual people tend to have an easier time dealing with death than those who are atheist?
There's actually mixed data on that. Some research has found that the more conservative and the more extrinsic one's faith is, so that means you're petitioning to a God outside and above. The more extrinsic the faith, the higher the death anxiety. Some studies indicate that. Other studies are inconclusive. But there is a fairly clear correlation that the more intrinsic your spirituality, the more equanimity and acceptance you have of death. So I have found it all mixed up. A lot of people worry, when a chaplain comes in the room, that it is about God, it is about religion. But as you mentioned, I figure if God is love, then your spirituality is not determined by the content of your belief. It's determined by the quality of your love. So let's focus on that. Is not limited to any faith tradition or any religious practice. It's embedded in the heart of every human being. The ultimate question, after all, is not, is there a God? The question is, what is consciousness? That's the big question, and does it continue afterwards? I just want to comment on something Janelle had touched on. She was talking about grief. I thought it was just eloquent and beautiful. I've been wondering, because grief for me is such an honorable aspect of a human being, revealing a nobility and a dignity and a capacity to love. I'm wondering, is grief the price we pay for love? Right? And how can we, with that, navigate through it to amplify our love and come to not any airtight questions of comfort, but come to a deeper sense of self. It's a journey I'm still exploring.
And I suppose that's why some people either consciously or subconsciously avoid love, avoid making themselves be vulnerable, because they want to avoid that inevitable process of grieving and loss that comes later. I wanted to ask you also, David.
Notice how we seem to spend a lot of energy avoiding ourselves. And it's so ironic, because at the end of life, I sit with so many who say, what happened? My decades flew by, and I don't remember much of it. When we're facing death, suddenly it brings us deeply into the moment that we've been striving to avoid. And navigating that well is astonishingly rewarding and satisfying, but so few of us in Western culture do it. I think the reason there's so much entertainment, murder shows and things with death, is evidence of how we suppress it. Whatever we suppress, we end up unconsciously projecting. So our society is in need of a lot of growth.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. Certainly death in the Western world is extremely sanitized, even hidden. But I wanted to ask you also about the role that rituals play, whether they're grieving or coming to terms with something. Should rituals be rooted some way in religion or spirituality to serve a purpose? And what kinds of rituals have you witnessed that have been the most helpful?
Yes, a ritual does not need to be rooted in a religious tradition. I have used some original rituals at the end of life. I recall one in which a young woman was dying, and she was in such distress because of a broken relationship with her parents. So we took, I learned this from another chaplain, we took the bed sheet that was on the chair, and for every story of pain and anguish in her family, she tied a knot into the bed sheet until at the end there was this massive ball. And then we invited her parents in, and we talked about the stories and undid the knots together, with each telling. And it ended in tears and in embrace and in compassion. It was really lovely. A ritual is an action combined with an intention to restore relationship, to awaken to the mystery of what we are, combined with an object, the sheet. Those three together, they're powerful. I think it was Janelle, you were talking about somatic grief work, right? We want to work it through the body instead of figuring it out through the mind. The body is wise, and the body keeps the score. Let's listen to the body.
What a beautiful visual you've created. I actually would like to go back to Janelle. I know that you mentioned that you lost your father to leukemia when he was only 53. Talk us through that process, that grieving process for you, and what, if any, rituals were the most meaningful and therapeutic for you when you were going through this?
Yeah, so my dad got diagnosed with leukemia when he was 49, so I was in my mid-20s, and or late 20s, anyways, doesn't matter. And he almost died was when he got diagnosed, being a really strong, powerful man. And, you know, there's some layers there with masculinity and illness and toughing it out. So by the time he got diagnosed, he got medevaced down from the Yukon, where we're from, down to Vancouver that very next day. And so it was a shock. The diagnosis was such a shock also because he wasn't home. And then he spent 4 years of going through treatments, a bone marrow transplant from his sister, recovering, getting sick again. And so I just want to name that because with cancer and with illness, you can actually have time to prepare for the death, which doesn't always happen. And so there's some elements of kind of pre-grieving, but also really hoping, of course, that the cancer will be cured, and all sorts of big feelings, anger, feeling it's not fair. You know, he's been tried so hard to be a good person and tried so hard to be healthy and still relatively young, and all those big feelings come up. And we used actually a lot of ritual. I think that I'm very fortunate. My parents came from backgrounds that didn't have a lot of ritual or spirituality, but my dad had been really pulled towards Buddhism, and my mom was really pulled towards exploring traditions related to Scottish heritage, which is some of our lineage, and seasonal celebrations. And so there was a lot of food and ritual, and inviting people to come, different things like inviting people to come and draw. My mom was studying expressive art therapy and counseling at the time, so she was using all her learnings on us. And so it became this not just family, but really big community event to invite people in to eat and draw and be with my dad. You know, sometimes he was really well and out and about, and other times he had a bed set up in the living room, especially for the last 9 months. And then he died. And even though we had 4 years to prepare for the inevitability that his cancer was not going to be cured, became clear after a couple years, it was really astonishing how the grief is different and just hits you no matter how much preparation. And something that's interesting is it doesn't always get you right away. So for me, it really hit me about 8 months after he passed, was when I suddenly felt like stopped. Like I couldn't keep working and all of those things, and really had to start tending to my grieving. But again, ritual and ceremony, and particularly in community, is so important. So a couple of the things my parents planned for that were really meaningful. My brothers and my dad are carpenters and woodworkers, so they wanted to build him a coffin. So they spent the last few months of his life building him a coffin together. And we had a ceremony around putting an object in the coffin to be burned with my dad's body. Unfortunately, although they got the dimensions for the coffin so that it would fit in the crematorium, and they built to those specs, they didn't get the correct dimensions, and it was an inch too wide to actually fit in the crematorium. But that actually turned into a really impromptu coffin burning ritual that happened elsewhere after my dad's body was cremated. And I'll just add one last thing. His funeral was big, and it was really beautiful, and he really pulled the dying man's last wishes out often. So in terms of humor, there's actually a lot of fun and humor that happens when you're experiencing a death and grieving process, and you really get into it, because things are really quite ludicrous. And so last man's dying wishes got pulled out far too often, but one of them was I used to do dance and choreography, and he saw a piece that I created, and he said, I want that at my funeral. I said, sure. My friend was dancing. He said, no, Janelle, I want you to dance at my funeral to this poem, which was actually about grief and loss. And so ritual can be co-created and based in tradition, but also blossom into its own thing.
I love that. We're just about to go to commercial break, but when we come back, lots more on how we can use death to live more fully. Don't go away.
just trailing the Blue Nose.
Angus should never have agreed to this last race. She's too old.
Eddie!
The cops are hanging back! Get to it, man!
Appears there's some kind of difficulty. There seems to be something loose up there, I believe. The console's foul!
Just once more, little girl, and you can rest.
Her last race and still undefeated. The Blue Nose out of Lunenburg, Nova Scotia was fastest in the world for almost 20 years.
He fell.
Whoa, I'm not driving. I'm way too stoned. How are you feeling, Veer?
Oh, since we had that talk, I'm not driving tonight at all.
What about you, Dave?
You only had a couple of drinks.
And only a couple of puffs.
I don't drink and drive. No way I'm getting behind the wheel when I smoked weed, too.
How are we getting home, then?
You can drive, Dave.
Come on, Dave.
Take one for the team, buddy.
Don't let weed and alcohol influence your decision to drive.
Yeah, I need a ride.
Join us as we look back at previous investiture ceremonies honoring great Canadians. Watch the Order of Canada exclusively on Rogers TV.
Hi, I'm Harriet Clooney. Come check out my show, Scrap Cooking, where I'm going to show you how to use the bits and bobs, the ends, pieces of things that you might otherwise throw in the compost. I'm going to show you how to turn them into something delicious.
Hi, welcome back to Ottawa Experts. I'm your host, Barbara Balfour, and we're discussing how to use death to live more fully. Before you go about making the practical arrangements for the end of life, it's important to understand what your values are about life, and the values that guide the way you live can also guide the way you choose to die. And Rena, you've got some great tools and resources that you offer on your website. Talk us through some of the tools that you can employ to figure out what life and death personally mean to you.
Sure. I don't even know where to begin. We have 6 free tools. We have 6 free tools and a few that cost some money. So, if you're listening to this and you're interested, just go and grab them in our shop. The free ones, that is, and explore them. Some of them are about writing lasting messages to people you love and future generations. And one of them is how to write your heart will, and one of them is how to write a legacy love letter. We also have in the workbook I mentioned earlier, a slew of tools that help you go through your, oh, there you go. So that's the 5 minutes legacy love letter. And it's very similar to the points that David brought up earlier about what people want to say, before they die. The prompts which are at the bottom are very simple. Thank you for what I love about you is, or what I appreciate about you is, the way you enhance my life includes such and such. I forgive you for, please forgive me, and my hopes and dreams for you are. And what's interesting about this tool is it's intended to be the last letter you're going to write to this person, because you don't know when you're going to die. But of course, the majority of people who use this tool, unlike the people that David's working with, don't have a terminal illness, or they're not palliative care or anything. So they're writing it just in case. And so the beauty of it is that it's going to, I can promise you, it will change your relationships with whoever you're writing it to.
And why
even
is
if they
that?
never see it.
Is it because it's sort of uncensored, no holds barred? You're not concerned about being judged?
There's that, and it's also because it's a love letter. This isn't the kind of letter where you're gonna do all your grievances and try to get through things. You can write that, and it's a good idea. If you have a lot of grievances, it's a great idea to write that out, but then go back and edit it. This is the letter that you imagine they're going to read after you die. So you have to really put yourself in that place. Okay, I'm gone. What do I want to leave this person with? So it's love. It comes out as love, and people, as David said, people, when they are dying, it's easy for them to do this. It's because they're there. But we're saying, imagine you're there even if you're not there, and it's going to change your life. Yeah, so that's one of the tools. In the workbook, we have a whole exercise about identifying your core values. So often when people do end-of-life planning, that question comes up, what are your values? And people think, oh, I don't know what my values are. Like, I guess I have values, but I don't know what they are. So we have a whole exercise that helps you figure that out. And then the beauty is, like, once you identify your values, let's say you have come up with 3 or 5 words, whatever it is, you can think, wait, are those the values that I live my life by, or are those the values that I wish I lived my life by? And so they sort of call you into action to change the way you're living, so that when you die, you don't have those regrets. That's the idea.
And what about the 9 things to include in your departure directions?
Mm-hmm.
We have a graphic for that as
well. So that's a tool that's developed. So departure directions is our term for your written either guidelines or instructions for how you want to be cared for after you die. And it's always based on your values and priorities and your beliefs. So there you can see it. There's a lot of words there. So on the right side, there are the 9 actual practical things you want to put in those directions. And I won't read them out because I think the more interesting part is the left side of the page, which is how do you figure out what you want? Mm-hmm. Well, you look at your values and beliefs and priorities that you've already determined from the other exercise, and you look at what 5 factors, these 5 factors that will help you make those choices. So for example, one of them, the first one is your relationship to your body or to your corpse. Like, how are you going to feel about that? What do you think about that now? And of course, generally right now, the choices are cremation and burial, although we were just talking about the fact that human composting, or it's known as organic reduction, is now legal in Washington State and operating there, and that's going to come to us soon. But so, how do you decide what you want without knowing what your relationship to your body is, your corpse? And the second factor is thinking about cultural, spiritual, and community traditions. Of course, like some people have very strong ones and they help them guide them. Some people have come from very strong traditions, but they don't want nothing to do with them. So it's a very interesting exploration right there. Mm-hmm. And some people don't have any and they want them. So it's just a fascinating exploration. A third one is the social and community impact. Your death is going to may impact many, many other people, from the way that you're memorialized to the way your end-of-life rituals happen, your funeral or whatever you want to call it. And we say that a great funeral is a community building event, a village making event. The fourth factor is ecological impact. If our values are if we have strong ecological values now while you're living, why not use those and have them while you're dying? And there are many choices along the way, from the time you die to the time your body is finally laid to rest, that have different impacts, and that's a whole other conversation. But there's many different things you could do or not do. And then finally, and we always do put this last, it's cost and practical considerations. We put that last because we don't want people to be too limited, Yeah.
No, thank you very much for a really handy framework for people to use.
And that's a free tool.
When they're contemplating those decisions, and they can access all those resources free of charge on your website. I want to go back to David. David, you've had a near-death experience, and you're very open in talking about how science tells us that what you see is often not what you get. Talk to us a little bit about what that experience was like for you, and maybe the role that intuition plays, and that sometimes our bodies know something before our head tells us.
Yes, we in Western culture tend to believe what you see is what you get. And countless people have said, well, when I'm dead, that's it, that's the end. And that's actually kind of comforting for them, because if you have no consciousness and awareness, there's nothing to be afraid of. However, I look at science. The best of cosmology and astronomy and physics tells us that what we see is not what we get. What we see makes up 0.004% of the entire universe, the visible spectrum of light. And all of the atoms, all of the matter in the universe, that only comprises 4%. So 23% of the universe is dark matter, and over 70% remaining is something called dark energy. So we are a fundamental mystery. We arise from something that cannot be explained from, I believe, this level of reality. The spiritual traditions have been pointing to it all along. And this is quite surprising. Mystical experiences, near-death experiences out of body, are very common. 1 in 10 people who have a heart attack or a cardiac episode will have these. vast majority of people, as they're dying, will have nearing death awareness in which they perceive another realm, the spirit of loved ones. They are filled with peace. Now, I acknowledge there are some difficult deaths, of course, but when pain is well controlled, nearing death awareness is just this staggeringly beautiful phenomenon. My own father experienced it in September, and we were so grateful to witness this. My own near-death experience taught me that, again, your spirituality, or the whole story is all about love, but love is not an emotion. We're talking about love as the highest state of consciousness. So how do you tap into that? Well, trust that you arise from it, and through your body, which will tell you the truth about how you're actually doing, through your intuition, you can move in through the side door. It's a lateral sense of knowing and experiencing. This is too big for the mind to process through logic or analysis. It's too big for that. It's a universal phenomenon, not limited or to any particular religion. It's quite wondrous, and my own experience has left me homesick for what I saw. But I moved through the world trying to do the work I sense I was supposed to do.
Very touching story, David. Now, we only have a couple of minutes left before the end of our time together. The hour has just flown by, but I wanted to go back to Janelle and ask you if you have any thoughts. Simply, how can people provide support to someone who's grieving, and how can you ask for support when you're grieving?
Oh gosh.
We only have a couple minutes left before the end of the show. Sorry to stick you with a doozy.
If you know someone has lost someone or is having a tough time, is probably grieving, it's really helpful to say, I know you lost someone and I don't understand it, but here I am. If you need someone, I can sit with you and listen. It's not really helpful to say, how can I help you? Because that's putting a big weight on someone who's already overwhelmed. But actually just to simply acknowledge someone has had a loss and is in pain, and to be okay with probably being awkward. Just be okay with being awkward. It's better than being awkward and silent, which is usually what happens, and then the person feels ignored.
I'm glad.
And if
I'm
you
glad
are
you brought
grieving,
that up, because sometimes you don't know what you need, and you can't really necessarily ask for that. But we're at the end of our time together, so I wanted to thank you so much, Janelle, Rena, David. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and for sharing your thoughts, your insights, and your wisdom on a still very difficult topic to talk about in a meaningful way. And if you're watching us tonight, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great evening, and we'll see you again in the studio next week.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.
October 5th, 2014, my daughter was hit by a train. She was walking along the sides of the tracks, and it shattered her world.
Now you can enjoy the Amazon Prime Video app on Ignite TV. Just say Amazon Prime Video into your Ignite voice remote and watch Amazon originals like The Expanse.
They wanted to fight. We'll give them one.
The Wilds.
Are we in the actual Bermuda Triangle?
And The Boys.
That is amazing.
Prime members can stream Amazon originals, movies, TV shows, and more on Ignite TV today. Now you're in command.
This is Rogers TV Ottawa.
We always have to